The fact that Resident Evil 7 runs on the original Nintendo Switch is actually insane. And I am serious because, if you think about it, this is a fully photorealistic first-person horror game built on a brand new engine called RE Engine, with volumetric fog, real-time global illumination, subsurface scattering on human skin, physically based materials, a Louisiana plantation house with hundreds of unique props, motion-captured family members, a complete VR mode on PS4, native 4K and HDR on Xbox One X, a full campaign clocking in at around 10 hours, 2 paid story expansions, a free Not a Hero DLC, a 26 gigabytes install footprint on PC, and a swamp scene with floating bugs that animate independently of every other bug in the swamp. All of this running on a portable console released in March 2017 with a 4-core Tegra X1 mobile chip, 4 gigabytes of shared LPDDR4 memory, a peak graphics performance of around 393 GFLOPS when docked, and only 32 gigabytes of internal storage that the operating system already eats into. To give you an idea, the minimum PC requirement for this game asks for a GTX 960 with at least 2 gigabytes of dedicated video memory, which on its own is faster than the entire Switch SoC, not counting the rest of the PC. And before this video is over, I am going to show you the exact reason this version of the game has never officially left Japan. A 45 megabyte install file that secretly hides an entire 10-hour AAA horror game inside it, and a 2,000 yen ticket that gives you exactly 180 days before the game vanishes from your console. But first, let me tell you what was really fighting Capcom here. The number one enemy of Resident Evil 7 on the Switch was not the CPU or the GPU or even the tiny pool of memory. It was distance. Distance between the data center where the game actually runs, the player's couch, and the speed of light itself. Bandwidth, latency, and storage all fighting each other over scraps. Because here is the basic problem. Resident Evil 7 was the first game Capcom built on a brand new in-house engine called RE Engine. They started building both the game and the engine at the same time in 2014 with one platform in mind, a PlayStation 4. That PS4 had 8 gigabytes of unified GDDR5 memory running at 176 gigabytes per second of bandwidth. The Switch, by comparison, has 4 gigabytes of LPDDR4 running at 6 gigabytes per second, half the memory, roughly 1/7 the bandwidth, and a quarter of that 4 gigabytes is reserved for the operating system before the game ever loads. So Capcom is not just being asked to have the memory budget, they are being asked to fit a photorealistic horror game into around 3 gigabytes of usable space on a chip that streams data more than 6 times slower than the console it was designed for. Then add the storage problem. The base PC install of RE7 is 26 gigabytes. The Switch ships with 32 gigabytes of internal storage, and the user already has Smash, Mario Kart, the system files, save data, and update cache eating into that. A native cartridge release would need either a 32 gigabytes game card, which exists but costs Capcom roughly 4 times what a 16 gigabytes card costs, or a heavy download component that nobody has space for. Now, in earlier Resident Evil ports to the Switch, Capcom had already shown what they were willing to do and what they were not. Revelations 1 and 2 shipped natively in November 2017. Those games were originally built for the 3DS and the PS3, so squeezing them onto Switch was downscaling, not upresing. Resident Evil 5 and 6 came later, also native, also from a much older engine. Those ports were possible. RE7 was a different animal. New engine, current-gen target, photoreal lighting baked into every surface. The math did not work. If you have ever wondered why Capcom kept porting old RE games to the Switch but skipped over Resident Evil 7, this is the answer. The engine itself was the wall. There is a 45 megabyte file in the Japanese eShop right now that is the only door through that wall. We will get to it. But Resident Evil 7 aimed to do something almost arrogant. Capcom wanted the Switch version to be the full game, not a downscaled version, not a chapter-by-chapter cloud trickle, not a stripped-back handheld remix. They wanted every prop in the Baker house, every animation curve on the family, every drop of rain on the porch. The VR mode was not going to make the jump. That one was a hardware lockout. But the campaign, the DLC, the banned footage expansions, End of Zoe, not a hero. All of it had to be the same game a PS4 owner was running at home on a console that did not even have a hard drive. On paper, this should not have been possible. So instead of compressing the game down to fit the hardware, Capcom cheats beautifully, aggressively, constantly. They do not run the game on the Switch at all. They run it in a data center in Tokyo. Think of it like ordering food. A native port is cooking the meal in your own kitchen with whatever ingredients you have. A cloud port is the restaurant cooking it for you, and a courier riding it to your door in under 1 second, every single second, forever. As long as the courier never trips, the food shows up hot. The Switch is no longer a kitchen. It is a plate. Here is how it actually works. When you launch the cloud version, the Switch downloads a tiny 45 megabyte client. That client is basically a video decoder, an input forwarder, and a session manager. The entire text is already in English. Here it is exactly as provided. The actual game, the full PC version, the 26 gigabytes install, the RE engine, the lighting, the AI, the physics, lives on an NVIDIA-powered server farm operated by a Taiwanese company called Ubitus, hosted out of Tokyo. When you press a button on your Joy-Con, the Switch wraps that input in a tiny packet, fires it over Wi-Fi to your router, out through your ISP, across the Japanese mainland and into the data center. The server reads your input, advances the game by 1 frame, renders that frame, encodes it as H, 264 video, and streams it back to you. Round trip, 60 times a second, ideally in under 100 milliseconds. If you have ever played a cloud game and felt your aim sliding behind your thumb, you have felt this loop failing. That is the constraint failing in real time. And here is where the engineering deep dives get interesting, because this is not just remote desktop with a video filter. Ubitus had to solve 3 subsystems at once. Let me talk about the first one, video compression. A native game renders at, say, 1280 by 720 internally and outputs to your TV. A cloud game has to take that same frame, hand it to a hardware H. 264 encoder on the server in under 16 milliseconds, ship it down a residential internet line, and have the Switch decode it on a chip that was never designed for streaming. The Tegra X1 does happen to have a hardware video decoder that can handle 1080p H, 264 at 60 frames per second. That is the only reason this works at all. Without that one specific block of silicon on the Switch, the whole concept collapses. But let me come back to the second subsystem, because this is where the real engineering magic happens. Input prediction. When you push the right stick, the server does not get that input until something like 30 to 60 milliseconds later. Then it renders the frame. Then it ships the frame back. By the time you see the result of your input, another 30 to 60 milliseconds have passed. That is a long time in a horror game. So the client lies a little. It draws a small UI response immediately. The cursor moves, the menu highlights, the audio cue plays. The actual game state lags behind, but the surface twitches on contact and your brain accepts the illusion. Not always. Sometimes it slips, and when it slips, you know. And here is where the physical breaking point kicks in. Japanese broadband infrastructure is one of the few in the world that can sustain this kind of round trip reliably across an entire country. The median Japanese fixed broadband connection runs over 200 megabits down with sub 20 millisecond latency to a Tokyo data center. That is not the situation in most of the United States, in most of rural Europe, and most of Latin America. The reason RE7 Cloud version has never officially launched outside Japan is not licensing. It is physics. Capcom and Ubitus measured the latency budget honestly and decided the experience would fall apart over the broader internet. So they fenced it. And this had real consequences. Players who tried it on launch day in May 2018 reported the game playing surprisingly well on a hardwired connection in Tokyo and turning into a smeared, juddering mess the moment they walked into the next room with the console in handheld mode. Some hotel Wi-Fi connections refused to authenticate the streaming session at all. There is a 15-minute free demo on the Japanese eShop, precisely because Capcom needed players to test their own internet before paying. And the payment model itself is a confession. You do not buy the game. You buy a 180-day ticket for 2,000 yen, about $13. After 180 days, the game vanishes from your library unless you renew. The game never lives on your console. You are renting access to a slot in a Tokyo server rack. If you have ever rented an apartment, you know exactly what this feels like. You can paint the walls, you can move the furniture, but the day the lease ends, you walk out with nothing. And this is where things get really interesting if you compare it to two contemporaneous peers. Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice came to Switch in April 2019 as a native port. Ninja Theory's team worked with a porting house called QLOC to shrink an Unreal Engine 4 game with photoreal facial capture down to a 7 GB cartridge. They achieved it by halving the internal resolution to roughly 720 by 540 in docked mode, cutting volumetric effects, baking dynamic lights into static ones, and accepting a locked 30 frames per second with occasional drops. The game shipped, ran natively, and looked like a downgrade. A loved one, but a downgrade. The Witcher 3 went the other direction in October 2019. CD Projekt Red and Saber Interactive spent over a year rebuilding the game from the ground up for Switch. They re-encoded every texture, cut shadow distance, lowered NPC counts, and squeezed the entire open world onto a 32 GB cartridge. The text is already entirely in English. Here it is exactly as provided. The result was a technical marvel, but it was also visibly a Switch game. Soft, foggy, blurred at distance. Capcom looked at both of those examples and made a different choice. They refused to compromise the visual identity of RE7 in any way. No downscaled textures, no lower NPC counts, no baked lighting. If the game could not run on the hardware at full quality, the hardware would not run the game. The cloud would. And the player would never see a degraded version of RE7 with a Capcom logo on it. They paid for that decision with Reach. The cloud version never officially launched in North America, never in Europe, never in Australia. 8 years after release, the only legal way to play Resident Evil 7 on an original Nintendo Switch is to own a Japanese eShop account, have a credit card that bills to a Japanese address, sit on a Japanese-grade internet connection, and pay 2,000 yen every 180 days. The cost of preserving the visual identity of the game was almost the entire global Switch audience. Capcom traded a market for a principle. Whether that was the right trade is a fair argument, but it was a trade, and they made it consciously. This is not laziness. This was a conscious choice. And the trade has a second cost that nobody talks about. A native port becomes a permanent artifact. The cartridge sits on a shelf for 30 years. A cloud port has an expiration date written into its code. The moment Ubisoft turns off the Tokyo server, the Switch version of RE7 stops existing. Not stops being sold, stops existing. Every copy of the 45 megabyte client on every Switch in Japan becomes a useless icon. Capcom has actually committed to this directly. When they retired the original cloud version of Resident Evil Village, they gave players a 30-day shutdown notice and refunded outstanding rental days. The same fate is on the horizon for RE7. The game on your Switch is borrowed time by design. And yet, and this is the weird part, the cloud version of Resident Evil 7 sometimes feels closer to the developer's intent than the native PS4 version it streams from. The frame rate is steadier because the server in Tokyo is a fixed PC running on optimized hardware. It never struggles. The load times are nearly zero because the game is already loaded in server RAM. Every level transition is instant. The Baker House never stutters in the cloud version. The Margarites in the basement never fail to spawn. The audio mix never drops a layer because the CPU is busy decoding a save file. The Switch version, when the network behaves, is the cleanest version of Resident Evil 7 you can play. The version of the game that streams to a 4-inch screen in Tokyo is closer to Capcom's vision than the one running on the PS4 in the living room. The constraints created an artifact. Lifting them removed the artifact and created something stranger, a Resident Evil game that exists nowhere and everywhere at once, depending on what your router does in the next 12 milliseconds. For context, by September 2025, Resident Evil 7 had sold 93 million copies worldwide across all platforms. It has hit 1 million units sold every year for 8 consecutive years, a feat almost no horror game in history has matched. The Switch Cloud version is a rounding error in that total. It exists not because it sells well. It exists because Capcom and Ubisoft refused to let a hardware limitation define what a Switch owner could play. A native RE7 port did eventually arrive on Nintendo hardware, not on the original Switch, but on the Nintendo Switch 2 in February 2026, alongside Resident Evil Village. Capcom needed the newer Tegra chip, the LPDDR5 bandwidth, and the bigger storage envelope to make the math work natively. On the original Switch, the answer was always going to be cloud, or nothing. Capcom chose cloud. Resident Evil 7 on the original Nintendo Switch is not just a port. It is a quiet engineering miracle that most people will never fully understand. It is a 45 megabyte client pretending to be a 26 gigabyte game. It is a Tokyo server rack pretending to be a handheld console. It is a 2,000 yen rental ticket pretending to be a purchase. And for 8 years, in one country on the planet, on the weakest commercial home console of its generation, you have been able to walk into the Baker house with a Joy-Con in your hand and watch the rain hit Ethan's coat in full RE engine fidelity, because Capcom decided the only acceptable Switch version of RE7 was no compromise at all, even if the price was that the game would never truly live on your console. So, what do you guys think of Resident Evil 7 on the Switch? Do you still play it? Let me know down in the comments. That was it for today's video. A subscribe would be appreciated. Thanks for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.